September 10, 1944. Major Brian Urquhart sat at his desk in a British airfield command center, reviewing aerial photographs captured over the Netherlands. The images revealed something chilling. German armored units and SS divisions were regrouping exactly where the Allies had planned their ambitious airborne assault. His heart sank. For weeks, Urquhart had been analyzing intelligence reports, cross-referencing intercepted communications, reconnaissance photos, and field reports. Every source painted the same stark picture. The Germans, far from being demoralized, had reinforced their positions with fully operational panzer divisions, poised to strike the very zones where 35,000 Allied paratroopers were to land within a week. Urquhart gathered the photographs and hurried to the headquarters of Field Marshal Bernard Montclair, a stand-in for Montgomery. The evidence demanded scrutiny. Montclair, fresh from the triumphs of liberating Paris, was basking in glory. The German army had retreated across France, and victory seemed within reach. Now, Montclair was determined to conclude the war with a bold stroke in the Netherlands. Urquhart's task was clear: present the undeniable threat to Montclair's staff before the operation commenced. The proposed plan, known as Operation Skybridge, aimed to deploy airborne forces to seize critical bridges, enabling a rapid advance of armored divisions across enemy lines. But the intelligence suggested the plan was dangerously flawed. At just 25, Urquhart had already earned a reputation in the British intelligence corps for his meticulous analysis of threats to air operations. Using intercepted German communications, reconnaissance photos from RAF flights, and reports from resistance fighters on the ground, he built a comprehensive picture of enemy movements. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were positioned near Arnhem, precisely where British forces intended to make a critical landing. These were elite units, well equipped, with combat-hardened crews. Urquhart presented his findings to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commander of British Airborne Forces. He spread the aerial photos across the table, showing the concentrations of German armor. Browning barely glanced at them. "You're being overly cautious," he said dismissively. "The panzer units are remnants, reorganized. They won't interfere with our operation." Undeterred, Urquhart emphasized the operational readiness of the German forces. Intelligence intercepts confirmed that these were frontline units, not disorganized leftovers. A Danish resistance report corroborated the armored movements. This was not conjecture, it was a clear, present danger. The reaction at Montclair's headquarters was even more disheartening. The Field Marshal had already endorsed the Skybridge plan, seeking approval from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower to ensure adequate air support and supplies. Montclair was unwilling to reconsider his strategy, simply because a junior intelligence officer was raising alarms. Urquhart was labeled a pessimistic alarmist, his concerns dismissed as the overthinking of an inexperienced officer. Bureaucracy worked ruthlessly against conscientious officers. Questioning the judgment of senior commanders could end careers. Browning sent Urquhart away for a week, effectively sidelining him and suppressing inconvenient truths. Yet the facts remained. Eisenhower had serious reservations about the plan's assumptions. While it did not violate fundamental military principles, it hinged on a single, narrow corridor and a precise timetable. Any delay or unexpected resistance could jeopardize the entire operation. General Omar Bradley called the plan militarily reckless, while Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, commanding Allied air forces, deemed the timetable unrealistic. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder warned that September weather was unpredictable, potentially grounding air support. Montclair remained adamant. He argued that the Germans were demoralized and incapable of mounting an effective defense. "This is our chance to end the war months sooner," he insisted. Eisenhower approved Skybridge for political reasons, hoping to placate Montclair's ambitions while advancing Allied objectives. The operation's success relied on several risky assumptions: that German forces were weak and demoralized, that paratroopers could hold key bridges for 48 hours without heavy support, that armored columns could traverse 60 kilometers of a single road in 2 days, that September weather would cooperate, that intelligence on German positions was accurate, and that German commanders would not react swiftly. Each assumption was flawed, yet Montclair's team ignored warnings. By September 17, 1944, the largest airborne armada in history took to the skies from British airfields. Over 1,500 planes lifted off, carrying thousands of paratroopers and supplies. American forces landed in Eindhoven and Nijmegen successfully, securing bridges as planned. British airborne forces targeted Arnhem, but the drop zone was 7 miles from their objective, forcing troops to traverse heavily defended territory. The Germans responded far faster than anticipated. Field Marshal Walter Model, in the Netherlands for breakfast when reports came in, immediately grasped the situation. He summoned SS General Wilhelm Bittrich, commander of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. These units, exactly as Arcart had warned, were battle-ready, with tanks, artillery, and experienced troops. Bittrich understood that halting the British paratroopers before they could link with advancing armor would doom the operation. By the early hours of September 17th, the British 1st Airborne Division was descending over Arnhem. Lieutenant General John Frost led 750 men from the 2nd Parachute Battalion toward the northern approaches of the vital bridge. Their orders were clear: hold the bridge until the 30th Armored Corps could link up within 48 hours. But the relief they expected never arrived. The drop zone was distant from the target, and the terrain offered no cover. The paratroopers had to march several miles under constant enemy observation, through open fields and urban zones, where German forces waited in fortified positions. The intelligence warnings Arcart had provided seemed to come alive, as the British troops faced formidable opposition almost immediately. Model's rapid response ensured that German reinforcements reached Arnhem with frightening speed. Tanks rumbled along streets, while artillery units established firing positions to pin down the British. Bittrich's 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions maneuvered with precision, their experience and coordination making them far more effective than Montclair's planners had predicted. The paratroopers were now in a fight for survival. Across the rest of the operation, the situation was uneven. American paratroopers in Eindhoven and Nijmegen fared better, capturing their objectives and holding key bridges. However, the advance of British armoured units was delayed. One narrow road, just 62 kilometers long, became a choke point. Bridges destroyed or blocked by German forces turned the route into a deadly funnel, leaving tanks exposed to artillery and anti-tank weapons. Back at Arnhem, the paratroopers were running low on ammunition and medical supplies. Frost's men endured relentless shelling and infantry attacks. The surrounding 7,000 troops of the 1st Airborne Division were contained in a shrinking perimeter, unable to provide meaningful support. The promise of rapid reinforcement proved illusory. British tanks, advancing from the south, were pinned down or forced to halt by German defences. For 3 days, Frost's battalion held against overwhelming odds. Outnumbered and outgunned, the men fought with discipline and courage. They improvised defensive positions, rationed ammunition, and treated the wounded under fire. Yet, with each passing hour, the likelihood of survival diminished. The meticulous planning of Montclair could not compensate for the distance, the enemy's preparedness, or the failure to account for practical obstacles. The headquarters staff received grim reports. Major General Roy Arcart, overseeing the airborne operations, realized that the defenders at the bridge could not hold much longer. British forces, along with Polish allies who had been deployed later, attempted to break through, but German defences remained impenetrable. The relentless barrage of artillery, tank fire, and well-coordinated infantry assaults inflicted heavy casualties. By the evening of September 25th, 8 days after the operation began, the British forces were forced to evacuate under cover of darkness. The survivors retreated across the Rhine, using whatever boats and improvised means they could find. The losses were staggering. Out of 10,000 troops committed to Arnhem, only 2,400 made it back. Over 1,400 were killed, and roughly 6,000 were captured. In contrast, American paratroopers achieved many of their objectives in Eindhoven and Nijmegen. Bridges were held, and German defenses temporarily disrupted. Yet the disaster at Arnhem overshadowed these successes. Montclair refused to take responsibility publicly, attributing setbacks to poor weather, communication failures, and delays by the 30th Armored Corps. He declared the operation 90% successful because preliminary objectives had been met in the South, a claim widely criticized by intelligence officers and veterans alike. Arcart, whose warnings had been ignored, found vindication. Every prediction he made came true. The German panzer divisions were exactly where he had reported, and their rapid response shattered British airborne forces. The reconnaissance photographs and intercepted messages he had presented were accurate, yet bureaucracy and hubris had overridden practical intelligence. Despite the catastrophe, Montclair retained his reputation in Britain. Political considerations, public morale, and media support shielded him from accountability. British newspapers highlighted the bravery of paratroopers, while minimizing operational failures. Skybridge became a story of heroism rather than a lesson in mismanagement. The pattern that led to disaster in Arnhem revealed a dangerous overconfidence. Montclair had dismissed intelligence, underestimated enemy capabilities, and assumed success would follow from bold planning alone. His unwillingness to adjust in the face of contradictory evidence directly resulted in thousands of casualties. The operation illustrated how flawed assumptions at the top of command could translate into near-tragic outcomes on the ground. Even after the operation, Arcart's warnings remained overlooked. The lesson of Arnhem: careful intelligence must guide operational planning, and arrogance cannot substitute for strategy went largely unheeded. The men who survived carried the memory of what could have been prevented. With prudent decision-making, in the aftermath of Arnhem, the British High Command struggled to understand the full scale of the failure. Montclair remained confident in his decisions, defending his strategy as bold and necessary. Yet behind the scenes, senior officers questioned whether any operation could have justified such heavy losses. Intelligence officers, led by Major Brian Arcart, had long argued that the German panzer divisions were capable, disciplined, and positioned precisely where they would respond most effectively. Their warnings had been dismissed as overly cautious or pessimistic. As reports filtered in from the field, the reality became undeniable. Frost's battalion had held the bridge far longer than anyone expected, but ultimately, isolation and lack of reinforcements rendered their efforts futile. Arcart's meticulous analysis, compiled from aerial photographs, ultra-intercepts, and ground reconnaissance, had accurately predicted the German movements. Yet the British leadership's confidence in Montclair's plan overshadowed this evidence. The narrow roadways became a strategic nightmare. The armored columns, essential for linking with the paratroopers, faced constant delays due to terrain constraints, destroyed bridges, and enemy resistance. Every hour lost amplified the danger to the airborne units. Yet Montclair insisted on pressing forward. Communication failures exacerbated the situation. Messages were delayed, coordination between air and ground units faltered, and some units simply waited in vain for instructions that never arrived. By the fourth day, the Luftwaffe had regained partial air superiority in localized zones, further complicating supply drops and reinforcements. British paratroopers, already stretched thin, began to run dangerously low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Morale remained high due to sheer discipline, but exhaustion and relentless German attacks took a physical and psychological toll. Survivors were often forced to abandon the wounded or leave them behind, as they attempted to maintain defensive positions. Meanwhile, in Eindhoven and Nijmegen, American paratroopers faced less resistance but still experienced their share of difficulties. Their success highlighted the contrast with Arnhem. Proper planning, realistic assumptions, and rapid reinforcement could achieve objectives without catastrophic losses. The stark difference underscored the flawed assumptions underlying Montclair's decisions. The political dimension added further pressure. British media celebrated the heroism of paratroopers, framing the story as a daring operation. Yet intelligence officers and veterans quietly acknowledged the mismanagement. Montclair, however, remained untouchable in public perception. His insistence on claiming operational credit, while ignoring clear warnings, created a disconnect between public narrative and military reality. Arcart, frustrated but determined, documented the failures in detail. He noted that Montclair's plan relied on 6 critical assumptions: that German forces were weak and demoralized, that paratroopers could hold bridges for 48 hours without heavy support, that armored units could traverse difficult terrain quickly, that weather would remain favorable, that enemy intelligence capabilities were minimal, and that German command would react slowly. Each assumption had been flawed. The failure at Arnhem forced British command to reassess operational planning. Lessons from the battle emphasized the importance of listening to field intelligence, evaluating risks realistically, and maintaining flexibility in strategy. Officers who had questioned Montclair's plan were quietly vindicated, yet public and political pressures prevented full accountability. The sacrifices of airborne troops remained a tragic testament to misjudgment and hubris. By September 26, the evacuation was complete. Only a fraction of the British and Polish troops survived, crossing the Rhine under cover of darkness while under continuous enemy fire. Casualties were staggering. Out of 10,000 troops deployed to Arnhem, 2,400 escaped, 1,400 were killed, and roughly 6,000 captured. The operation's limited successes in Eindhoven and Nijmegen were insufficient to offset the catastrophic losses in Arnhem. Arcart returned from a brief leave shortly after the operation ended. He reviewed the aftermath with grim satisfaction. Every warning he had issued had been validated by the unfolding disaster. The German forces had behaved exactly as he predicted, confirming the accuracy of his intelligence. Yet bureaucracy and command culture had sidelined his analysis, leading to the needless suffering of thousands of troops. The aftermath also highlighted Montclair's character. His ability to retain public acclaim, despite clear operational failures, demonstrated how perception often outweighed reality in military leadership. Montclair blamed weather, delayed communications, and minor errors for the failure, while asserting that the operation had achieved 90% of its objectives. This framing ignored the central cause: flawed assumptions and the dismissal of reliable intelligence. The psychological impact on surviving troops was profound. Many felt that their sacrifices had been rendered meaningless by poor planning and hubris. Frost's battalion, in particular, had endured 3 days of relentless combat with minimal support, exemplifying courage under impossible circumstances. Their actions, while heroic, could not change the strategic outcome. Ultimately, the Battle of Arnhem became a case study in military schools. The importance of realistic planning, the dangers of overconfidence, and the critical need for accurate intelligence analysis. The operation illustrated that even bold and meticulously executed tactics could fail catastrophically when strategic assumptions were flawed. Arcart's role was remembered by peers as a model of diligence and prudence, a stark contrast to Montclair's overconfidence and insistence on public recognition. In the weeks following Arnhem, the British command structure faced intense scrutiny from within and outside military circles. While Montclair maintained his public image as a daring and competent leader, internally, doubts were mounting. Officers who had previously challenged his judgment quietly reinforced the importance of rigorous intelligence analysis, accurate risk assessment, and contingency planning. The sacrifices at Arnhem left a permanent mark on morale, shaping how future operations would be planned and executed. Major Brian Arcart, though sidelined during the operation, emerged as a critical voice in the post-mortem analysis. His detailed documentation of German troop positions, armored strength, and logistical capabilities became an essential reference for planning subsequent Allied operations. In the Low Countries, Arcart had proven that meticulous, evidence-based intelligence could predict enemy behavior accurately. But that leadership hubris could negate even the most reliable information. Montclair's insistence on taking personal credit for strategic decisions, while dismissing warnings, became a recurring theme in internal assessments. Officers noted a troubling pattern: the tendency to prioritize personal glory over operational safety and the welfare of subordinate troops. The operation had achieved partial success in Eindhoven and Nijmegen, demonstrating that well-supported airborne operations could work. But the catastrophic losses in Arnhem revealed that even small errors in assumption could cascade into disaster. The political consequences of Arnhem were significant. British newspapers celebrated Montclair's bravery and ingenuity, portraying the operation as a bold stroke to hasten the end of the war. However, intelligence officers and historians would later argue that these narratives obscured the reality of mismanagement. The discrepancy between public perception and military truth created tension within the Allied command, particularly between British and American officers who had witnessed the operation's failure firsthand. Arcart continued to serve in intelligence, respected for his precision and analytical rigor. His experience at Arnhem reinforced a core principle: intelligence is only valuable when it is not just collected, but also heeded. Officers in the field learned to weigh evidence carefully, communicate effectively, and challenge assumptions, even when it meant opposing senior commanders. Arnhem became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and the human cost of ignoring expertise. Montclair, meanwhile, remained influential but more cautious. Although he retained command over British forces, subsequent operations saw him deferring more to intelligence assessments and logistical advisors. The need to maintain credibility in the wake of Arnhem tempered his boldness, illustrating how failure can shape leadership behavior even at the highest levels. His public persona, however, continued to highlight daring and decisiveness, leaving many unaware of the operational lessons his setbacks had revealed. The lessons of Arnhem extended beyond the immediate military hierarchy. Allied planners recognized that assumptions about enemy morale, strength, and response time must always be verified. The reliance on outdated intelligence or overly optimistic projections could lead to catastrophic outcomes. Paratrooper units, despite their courage and professionalism, were only as effective as the command decisions guiding them. Misjudgments at the strategic level could nullify extraordinary heroism on the battlefield. In the months that followed, Arnhem influenced Allied strategy in Northern Europe. Future operations incorporated more rigorous risk assessments, multi-dimensional support for airborne units, and contingency plans for delayed reinforcements. Coordination between ground and air units was emphasized, ensuring that paratroopers were not isolated in hostile territory. The sacrifices of those who fought at Arnhem informed these changes, making their loss a catalyst for improved operational planning. Publicly, the operation remained a story of valor. Montclair's leadership was lauded, and the surviving troops were celebrated as heroes. Privately, the Allied command acknowledged the lessons of the failure. Arnhem was studied in war colleges for decades, serving as a reminder of the fragile balance between courage, planning, and intelligence. Overconfidence, lack of communication, and refusal to listen to experienced subordinates were identified as the primary causes of the disaster. Major Arcart's role was quietly honored. He became an example of analytical rigor, persistence, and moral courage. Despite being ignored during the operation, his foresight had been validated by the outcome. His work reinforced the principle that leadership must be accountable not only for boldness, but also for listening to evidence, particularly when lives are at stake. The contrast between Arcart's diligence and Montclair's hubris would shape military thinking for generations. By the end of 1944, the British Army had stabilized its position in the Netherlands. Montclair continued to command operations but with tighter oversight and a renewed focus on coordination and intelligence. The legacy of Arnhem served as both a cautionary tale and a learning opportunity. Courage alone could not guarantee success, and operational assumptions must always be tested against evidence. In retrospect, Arnhem stands as one of World War II's most dramatic lessons in the human cost of strategic miscalculation. The paratroopers' heroism was undeniable, yet their sacrifice was magnified by flawed planning and the dismissal of credible intelligence. Montclair's desire for glory clashed with operational reality, creating a tragedy that might have been prevented. Yet, through careful analysis and adaptation, Allied forces learned from the failure, applying these lessons to future campaigns that would ultimately bring victory. The Battle of Arnhem became emblematic of the dangers of arrogance in military command. It underscored that while bravery and skill are critical, the wisdom to listen, assess evidence objectively, and adjust plans in response to new intelligence is equally vital. Major Brian Arcart's foresight saved countless lessons from being lost, ensuring that the costs of overconfidence were not repeated. Arnhem's story is a testament to both human courage and the necessity of accountable leadership. In the crucible of war,